Hi class, today we're going to be talking about some uses of sheep so that when you get to your breed ID project, you'll be able to look at some different characteristics that will tell them apart based on the products they produce. So the first one of those, like we've seen with our beef cattle and our swine so far, is the meat itself. So when sheep are raised for meat, they are either raised for lamb or for mutton. And the difference really is based on their age. So if they are harvested at somewhere between 2 and 15 months old, that would qualify as lamb. Whereas if they're usually somewhere in the 1 to 3 year old range, that would be more mutton. At that point, they're fully grown. As lambs grow, they get a stronger taste because their body switches over from building a lot of muscle very quickly to building some fat. And that fat has a strong taste that a lot of people in the US don't really like. So usually when lamb is harvested in the US, it's at a market weight of somewhere between 110 and 160 pounds. Spring lamb is another category, and that is harvested younger at around 3 months old, somewhere between 55 and 75 pounds, and that will have a much milder flavor because the animal was so young. In addition to meat, sheep are very important for dairy as well, and especially cheeses. So traditionally, feta, manchego, roquefort, which is a blue cheese, and pecorino romano, those all come from sheep's milk, not cow's milk, although there are now cow's milk varieties as well. And a growing use of sheep is actually controlling vegetation. They are grazers, so they will keep the grass down in certain areas, and they're being found to be really useful in areas where you have solar panels because it's really hard to mow and weed whack around the solar panels. So sheep come in and they eat up all that grass and they keep the area nice and neat and allow all of the sun's radiation to get right to those panels. And then, of course, we have fleece. When sheep are raised for wool, it produces a really high quality fiber. And even though this fiber has become less popular now with all of the plastic based alternatives that we have, it's still got some really cool benefits. So one of the cool things about wool is it's made to keep the sheep dry. So it actually has a hydrophobic or water repellent exterior, but the inside absorbs water. It's hydrophilic. So what wool does really well is it wicks moisture away from the body. It pulls it out to the outside where it can then evaporate. So wool dries a lot faster than cotton or than any of our synthetic materials. And because of that, it's becoming more and more popular. It's naturally antimicrobial, so that bacteria won't grow. It's really, really good at temperature control because it's both breathable and insulating at the same time. So it'll keep you cool in warmer environments, but it keeps you warm in the cold environments. It's a sustainable resource because we can keep raising these animals and you can shear them once or twice a year depending on the breed, and they aren't harmed in any way by being shorn, so you can keep those animals around and keep doing that over and over. It's hypoallergenic, it's very durable, it's also naturally fire retardant, and it doesn't wrinkle. So lots of benefits of raising these sheep for wool. Now, naturally, all sheep were actually originally hair sheep. And the difference between a hair sheep and a wool sheep is that a hair sheep sheds its fur every year. So just like a dog would go through a shedding pattern in the spring, these hair sheep do the same thing. And if you've ever been around our sheep at school in the spring, you'll notice they have these giant patches of fur that are falling out. And a lot of times it gets better with brushing or as they're able to rub against things. So that's the shedding mechanism. Wool sheep do not shed. They cannot shed. It doesn't fall out on its own. So they have to be sheared. And that's the advantage still of these hair sheep is that you don't need to shear them. But of course you can't produce wool from them either. So this guy right here, his name is Shrek. He's a merino. He was in New Zealand and he actually wandered away from his flock. And because of that, he didn't get shorn for 6 years. And when they sheared him, they got 60 pounds of wool off of him. So that is not normal for a wool sheep, and it's not healthy either. That's not something that you want to do, as fun looking as he may be, because they really, at that point, can't regulate their temperature at all. So shearing is an important thing to do once or twice a year with all of these wool sheep. Wool quality depends on a lot of different things, including its yield, its fiber diameter, crimp, color, and staple length. White wool is definitely preferred over dark wool because the white wool will accept dye where the dark wool will not, so you are pretty much stuck with that color. Something called staple length is measured from the base of the wool to the tip of the unstretched fiber. And that staple length is important because longer staples are stronger, and because of that, they're more valuable. They can withstand vigorous cleaning and manufacturing, so you can make them into cloth easier. Crimp is the natural waviness of the wool fiber, and usually that is a good indication of diameter also, because fine wools have more crimp per unit of length than the coarser wools. So that can be used to predict this next factor. Fiber diameter is the number one most important wool characteristic to determine its quality and its price. And because of that, we're going to talk a lot about fiber diameter with these different breeds. So in general, the finer the fiber diameter, or in other words, the smaller it is, these ones kind of in here, the more valuable it's going to be. The coarser or bigger the diameter, the thicker it is, then that's not going to be as preferable of a grade. And wool is graded based on its diameter. So you can look right here and you see fine wool compared to coarse wool. You can see how these cuticles that are on the hair, they are a lot closer together. They're not as spread out as in the coarse wool. And that fine wool with those tight cuticles really makes for a fiber that's going to behave a lot better. It's not going to get torn up as much. You can kind of compare that to alpaca fiber, which is the next one there, which again, like a really fine wool, but really tight cuticles. And then cashmere, which is from a goat. This is silk, which has no cuticle at all. And then you get into some of your plant and plastic-based fibers over here. So you can kind of compare to those. So the first fiber diameter we're going to take a look at is fine wool. So this is the smallest fiber diameter and smallest staple length generally too. And this is really desirable, so it makes up more than half of the worldwide wool production. The coats of these fine wool sheep actually produce more oils, and sheep produce an oil called lanolin. So that lanolin actually helps them kind of stay waterproofed so that they don't get too cold, because their wool isn't going to hold on to that water for a long time. It puts a barrier in between their skin so that the water does not sit right on them. So fine wool sheep produce a lot more of that lanolin, and because of that, you get a lower yield of clean wool in the end. So you really do have to grow quite a bit to get that payout. But it is really higher quality. It's much more expensive. You can earn more from it. And part of the reason for that is fine wool is much less likely to make people itchy. So this can be used to make undergarments. It can be used to make socks and things like that that are going to touch the skin directly. Long wool, on the other hand, would be kind of the opposite of that. They're longer staple lengths and larger diameter fibers. Because they are long wool sheep, they have less lanolin. They have so much wool surrounding them that they don't need as much of those oils. So you get a higher yield from these types of sheep. These are favored by hand spinners and by weavers, because you can imagine that if you're trying to take a piece of wool and turn it into thread, a longer piece is going to be a lot easier to do that with than a shorter piece like you would with fine wool. And these are really common sheep to find in cool and wet environments, because all of that wool helps to keep them warm. So they're going to do really well in those harsher areas. Medium wool is what it sounds like. It's in between. So in between fiber length, in between diameter. Most of our meat breeds and about 15% of all sheep are in this medium wool category, including some of our most popular breeds. So it's kind of like the happy medium between the two. It's not as valuable as the fine wool, but you don't have as much lanolin, so you get more yield out of it. And then it is a little bit finer than this long wool, so a little bit more in demand. In addition to the fine, long, and medium wool sheep, we have carpet wool sheep and fur sheep. So carpet wool is the coarsest, largest diameter fiber possible, and it's very wiry and it's very tough. So this is definitely not something that you'd want to wear as clothing, but it's really good for making carpets. So that's where it gets its name, because it's very, very durable. The length is one of the longest. It can be up to 13 inches in staple length. And all of our double coated breeds are going to fall in this carpet wool category. So double coated meaning they have an undercoat as well as a top coat. Then we have fur sheep. Fur sheep are what are usually harvested for those slippers and sheepskin rugs and things like that. So when they are harvested, they're usually used for both meat, and then their wool and their sheepskin is harvested in one piece like this, so that you have leather connected to the actual fur itself. And because of that, you wouldn't shear a fur sheep because you're purposely harvesting them in that form. So wool has to be processed. So first the sheep is sheared to remove the fleece, and then it gets baled up a lot like hay. But it has to be washed or scalded, and that is done to remove all of the dirt. And then it has to be carded, and this carding machine has little tines in it, like little combs, and it basically combs all of the fibers so they're facing the same direction, and it puts them into a sheet. That sheet is then twisted down so that it's in a rope that they call a sliver, and then that rope can be stretched out and spun into yarn, which is much finer, and that yarn can be put into balls that can be then woven. So you can see how much the wool changes during this process, goes from this greasy wool with the lanolin mixed in to here now it's washed and cleaned. The carding puts all the fibers in the same direction, and then you're able to spin it into yarn. And you're left with a total yield, and that is the amount of wool that you're left over with at the end. It's usually expressed as a percentage of the original grease fleece weight, which would be this. And because of that, you talk about shrinkage in wool. And that's really that shrinkage that you get comes from all the weight that you lose from the lanolin, from sand and dirt and dust and vegetable matter that may be stuck into that wool. So the typical yield in wool can vary quite a bit based on the breed, but it's usually somewhere between 40 to 70% of what you actually shear. And that's affected by a lot of different factors, both genetic factors and environmental factors. So one of the other things we talk about when we talk about fleece quality is its bulkiness. And bulky means that you get a high yield out of it, you don't have as much waste. So you'd be somewhere more towards the 70% end of that spectrum. All right, so those are some of the things we're going to talk about when we talk about your breeds, is the type of wool they are bred for or the other purposes. So go ahead now and we'll move on to your actual sheep breeds.